Thank you very much for such a warm welcome. It's very exciting to be here. This is the first time that I visit Australia, and it's a great honor to be spending International Women's Day with everyone. A special thanks to the civil society arm for UN Women Australia for bringing me to be here, as well as to the Hawke Center and the Don Dunstan Foundation for supporting today's event. Yesterday, on International Women's Day, I joined a group of 10 Australian women and one brave man who joined the delegation, and a global campaign led by Women for Women International to walk across bridges as a symbol of the important work that women bring to peace negotiations across the globe. This particular day, for the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day, was dedicated to women in Afghanistan and the importance of them being part of the Loya Jirga on peace. The bridge walk across Sydney Harbour was part of over 200 bridges that were crossed and over 50 countries that were participating. This experience actually made me a little bit of in debt to women in Australia, and I'll tell you why. Because I personally have a really intense fear of heights. And so while I was doing this, and Australia not only launched the campaign because of the time zone being the first country, but we weren't walking across the bridge, we were literally walking over the bridge. And so as I was climbing, I was being encouraged by the 10 Australian women and the one man that was part of the delegation, who we will not forget. That encouragement brought home to full circle that as I was working for the past 15 years with women to conquer their fears, now I was in a position where Australian women were helping me conquer my own fear. So thank you to the women for that. And it's that spirit of encouragement that makes International Women's Day so powerful. And before I continue, I wanted to make sure to congratulate everyone, because it's not just International Women's Day, but as I mentioned, the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day. A real cause to celebrate, and also to pause and remember the achievements of all the women, our foremothers who came before us, that made a celebration like this today possible, through hard dedication and work of pioneering foremothers who had the vision of change, a vision that we still feel dedicated to continue to move forward. Over the last 15 years working with women, I have realized the importance of remembering the work that came from women before. I also recognize that we can't treat women's issue as a side marginal issue, that it needs to be part and parcel of larger issues and something that's well integrated within national platforms. I often like to address the issue of women as something that's essential and primary for any type of achievement within a nation. Today, I would like to look at the issue of women in the context of civil society in Iraq and the nation-building process. From 2003, when the international community initially entered into Iraq, little attempts were made to really understand what Iraqi civil society had suffered, little attempts to have a healing process, and what that presented was a missed opportunity to build on previous experience inside the country. Instead, there was an urgency to talk about a new Iraq and its new civil society. This desire to get in and start building failed to acknowledge the rich history of the country and the powerful women's movement that had happened decades earlier. Iraqi history had been minimized to the 30 years of the Saddam Hussein regime's crimes against humanity. Iraq has always had a vibrant civil society, with some of the women's organizations dating back to the early 1900s, and professional associations such as Doctors, Engineers, or Lawyers Union playing an important role in the Iraqi national debate. Despite the political turmoil, many of these civil society advocates always found a way to remain active in their community. In 2003, Iraqi women were talking about ways that they were going to leap forward. They were very confident that they would be able to reclaim the legacy that their foremothers had had in Iraq since the early 1900s. In the region, there is a lot of debates talking about the personal status law. That's the law that deals with inheritance, it deals with divorce and marriage. And Iraq was proud that they had one of the best personal status laws dated back to 1958, a law that many neighboring countries today don't have, which was as liberal as the 1958 law. At the same time, over the last decade in Egypt, one of the biggest conversations was, could women, female judges be judges? And in Iraq, they had judges since the 1960s. Enrollment of women and girls in rural areas of literacy centers was very common throughout the 1970s and 1980s in Iraq. And in fact, in 1979, Iraq had won a UNESCO award for practically eliminating female illiteracy. So as I mentioned, in 2003, Iraqi women were talking about how they were going to leap forward, that they had always been the pioneers of women's rights in the region, and this would be an opportunity for them to reclaim what they had lost under the Saddam regime. They often pointed out that women in Iraq had gained the right to vote in 1980, a right that many neighbors in the country still have not gained in the region. And fortunately, Iraqi women quickly realized that the idea of leaping forward was not going to materialize. In fact, in 2011, Iraqi women are fighting just to maintain the status quo and to maintain the rights that they had already guaranteed to them as far back as the 1960s. Sanctions, several wars have caused the situation for Iraqi women to deteriorate. And it is not uncommon to find a grandmother that is literate and traveled regionally who has a granddaughter that is now illiterate and has not traveled from her village. Women often complain that any parent's dream is to provide their children with a better life, and yet in Iraq they had to watch as things continue to backslide. Therefore, whenever people are talking about building civil society, the missing ingredient is really truly unbuilding or deconstructing what has happened in the country before. The meaning of the word has become so distorted, the meaning of the word civil society has become so distorted that for many in Iraq the legacy was unrecognizable. And a lot of people began to believe the international perception that civil society never existed in Iraq, rather than building on what had previously existed. I would like to focus, for the purpose of this audience, on the international lessons learned from the involvement of working with women in Iraq. Starting with the fact that we ignored the previous Iraqi women's experience and therefore found ourselves starting from ground zero, but highlighting a few other lessons that I learned in the process while I was working and living in Iraq. First, when we're talking about women's issues, I call it the nice versus the necessary debate. There isn't anything called it's a nice thing to do when we're talking about women. It's simply necessary. It's smart and it's strategic. If we want to talk about economic growth, if we want to talk about stabilizing nations, if we want to talk about globalization and providing global security, you got to talk about women. Not investing in women is frankly foolish. So nobody is doing women any favors when they're talking about women, investing in women, or focusing on women in post-conflict. They're simply doing what is best for a stable nation or for global economic growth. Second, understanding what freedom looks like. And all of us have that image in our head of what we think women's rights mean or what we think freedom should look like. But it's important in this diverse global community that we open the debate and that we recognize that women's rights look differently and will be different as much as the women that populate this earth. Understanding at the same time, which goes to my third point, that comes hand in hand with a balancing act. So while we're saying that on the one hand we really need to understand that the way we view freedom and the way we view women's rights needs to be open for a national, global debate so that it can be redefined to be something that's all-encompassing, we also need to balance that out with the concept of universal rights.